After the bloodiest battle of his career, with Roman corpses piled so high they formed walls across the Italian countryside, with his enemies fleeing in absolute terror before the might of his war elephants, King Pyrrhus of Epirus stood victorious. His generals rushed to congratulate him. They had done it again. Another impossible victory against the most disciplined army in the Mediterranean. The Romans had thrown everything they had at him, 40,000 of their best soldiers, their legendary legions, their iron will, and Pyrrhus had broken them again. But when his officers raised their swords in triumph, when they chanted his name as the greatest general since Alexander himself, Pyrrhus didn't smile. He looked out over the battlefield, surveying the carnage, counting not the enemy dead, but his own. Thousands of his irreplaceable veterans lay motionless in the Italian mud. His best commanders had fallen. The elite cavalry he had brought from Greece was decimated. And then he said something that would echo through the next 2,000 years of human history. If we win one more victory against the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined. One more victory like this, and he would have no army left to command. This is the story of Pyrrhus of Epirus, the man who gave us the term Pyrrhic Victory, a military genius who never lost a major battle but somehow lost everything. A king who dreamed of empire but died in a street fight. A legend who almost stopped Rome from becoming Rome. And the craziest part, if you'd asked anyone in 280 BC who would dominate the ancient world, they would have laughed at the suggestion that it might be those backwards farmers on the Tiber River. The smart money was on Pyrrhus. To understand how a winner became history's most famous loser, we need to go back to a world that looks nothing like the one Rome would eventually create. It's 319 BC, and in the mountainous kingdom of Epirus, a rugged land in what is now northwestern Greece and southern Albania, a boy is born into chaos. His name is Pyrrhus, and he enters the world at possibly the worst moment in his family's history. His father, Aeacides, is the king of Epirus, but king is a generous term. Epirus is a small, poor, backwards kingdom on the fringes of the Greek world. While Athens built the Parthenon and Sparta forged its legendary warriors, Epirus raised goats and fought petty tribal wars. The Greeks of the great city-states looked down on the Epiro as barely civilized barbarians. But Epirus did have one thing going for it: blood. The royal family of Epirus claimed descent from Achilles himself, the greatest warrior of the Trojan War, the hero of Homer's Iliad. Whether this was actually true is anybody's guess, but it mattered enormously in a world where mythology was history and lineage was destiny. Pyrrhus grew up believing he was the heir of the mightiest warrior who ever lived. He would spend his entire life trying to prove it. His childhood, however, was a master class in survival. When Pyrrhus was just 2 years old, a political uprising forced his father from the throne. The infant prince was smuggled out of the country in the dead of night, carried by loyal servants through hostile territory, across raging rivers, to the neighboring kingdom of Illyria. One of those servants, according to legend, nearly drowned in a flooded river while keeping the baby prince above water. The king of Illyria, Glaucias, took in the refugee child. When assassins came demanding the boy be handed over, Glaucias reportedly found the toddler Pyrrhus crawling toward his throne, grabbing at his robes, staring up at him with fierce eyes. The king was so moved, or perhaps so impressed by the child's boldness, that he adopted Pyrrhus and raised him as his own. By age 12, Pyrrhus was back on his father's throne, restored by Glaucias's army. By 17, he had lost it again in another coup. By 23, he had won it back once more, this time for good. This is the pattern of Pyrrhus's life: constant motion, constant conflict, crowns won and lost, and won again. He was never at rest, never satisfied, never willing to accept what he had when something greater might be seized. But to understand why Pyrrhus became the warrior he did, you need to understand the shadow that loomed over his entire generation. Alexander the Great. Alexander had died in 323 BC, just for years before Pyrrhus was born, but his legend was very much alive. In just 13 years, Alexander had conquered the largest empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Greece to Egypt to the borders of India. He had never lost a battle. He had defeated the Persian Empire, the mightiest power of the age, with an army that was always outnumbered. He had marched his men across deserts and over mountains that were supposed to be impassable. He had made himself a god. And then he died at 32, leaving behind a power vacuum that swallowed the ancient world. Alexander's generals, the Diadochi, or successors, tore his empire apart in a series of brutal wars that lasted for decades. By the time Pyrrhus came of age, Alexander's conquests had fractured into three major kingdoms: Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the east, and Macedon in the north, plus dozens of smaller states, all jockeying for position, all dreaming of reuniting Alexander's legacy under their own rule. Pyrrhus was related to Alexander through his mother, Phia, who was a cousin of Alexander's mother, Olympias. This connection was no mere genealogical footnote, it was the foundation of Pyrrhus's self-image. He didn't just admire Alexander, he believed he was meant to complete Alexander's work. As a young man, Pyrrhus served in the wars of the Diadochi, fighting alongside Demetrius Poliorcetes, the besieger, one of the most flamboyant and reckless of Alexander's successors. It was an education in large-scale warfare, in siegecraft, in the politics of power, but it was also a lesson in the limits of military genius. Demetrius won spectacular victories and suffered crushing defeats. He conquered kingdoms and lost them. He was, in many ways, a preview of Pyrrhus himself, brilliant, bold, and ultimately unable to turn tactical success into lasting power. Pyrrhus learned warfare from these campaigns. What he didn't learn was patience. By 295 BC, at the age of 24, Pyrrhus had secured his hold on Epirus and begun expanding his kingdom. He was already considered one of the finest generals of his age. His soldiers worshipped him. He fought in the front lines, shared their hardships, and led by example in a way that inspired fanatical loyalty. Ancient sources describe him as tall, fierce-looking, with a continuous row of teeth in his upper jaw that gave his face an unsettling intensity. Hannibal Barca, the legendary Carthaginian general who would terrorize Rome a century later, reportedly ranked Pyrrhus as the second greatest commander in history, behind only Alexander himself. Some accounts put Pyrrhus first. Either way, the ancient world recognized him as something special, a general of almost supernatural ability. But Epirus was too small for his ambitions. The mountains that had sheltered his ancestors now felt like a prison. Pyrrhus wanted what Alexander had wanted, everything. And in 281 BC, an opportunity arrived from the most unlikely direction. A delegation from southern Italy came bearing an offer that would change history. To understand what the Italians wanted from Pyrrhus, you need to understand the strange world of Magna Graecia, or Greater Greece, the network of Greek colonies that dotted the coastline of southern Italy and Sicily. These weren't recent settlements. Greeks had been colonizing Italy for centuries, establishing cities like Tarentum, Syracuse, Croton, and Thurii. These colonies had become wealthy and sophisticated, often surpassing their mother cities back in Greece. Syracuse, on the island of Sicily, was one of the largest and richest cities in the entire Mediterranean world. But the Greeks of Italy faced a problem. They were surrounded by people who wanted to kill them. The Italian peninsula in 280 BC was a patchwork of different peoples, cultures, and political systems. In the center were the Romans, a Latin people who had spent the previous century conquering their neighbors and building a confederation that now dominated central Italy. To the south were the Greek colonies, and in between were various Italic tribes: Samnites, Lucanians, Bruttians, who had their own complicated relationships with both Romans and Greeks. For generations, the Greek cities had played these groups against each other, maintaining their independence through diplomacy, bribery, and occasional warfare. But by the 280s BC, the balance of power was shifting dangerously. Rome was on the rise. The Romans had just completed a brutal series of wars against the Samnites, the most powerful of the Italic tribes. They had absorbed or allied with most of central Italy. They were building roads, establishing colonies, and systematically extending their influence southward. And everywhere they went, they brought their particular brand of ruthless efficiency. The Greek city of Tarentum, modern Taranto, located on the heel of the Italian boot, watched this expansion with growing alarm. Tarentum was the wealthiest and most powerful of the Greek cities in Italy, but wealth doesn't mean much when your neighbors have better armies. The Tarentines were merchants and sailors, not warriors. They had grown soft and comfortable behind their walls. When a Roman fleet sailed into Tarentine waters in 280 BC, technically violating an old treaty that prohibited Roman ships from entering the Gulf of Taranto, the Tarentines panicked. They attacked the Roman ships, sinking several and killing the Roman admiral. Then, for good measure, they marched on the nearby city of Thurii, which had allied with Rome, captured it, and expelled the Roman garrison. It was a spectacular act of aggression. It was also incredibly stupid. The Tarentines had just started a war they couldn't possibly win. Rome demanded reparations. Tarentum refused. Rome began mobilizing for war. Tarentum looked around for allies and found none of the other Greek cities willing to risk Roman anger. The Italic tribes were either allied with Rome or too exhausted from previous wars to help. There was only one option left: call for help from the old country. The Tarentine ambassadors who arrived at Pyrrhus's court in 281 BC came bearing an irresistible offer. They painted a picture of a Greek world under threat, of civilized people about to be overwhelmed by Italian barbarians, of the heritage of Hellas on the verge of destruction. They appealed to Pyrrhus's pride, his lineage, his sense of destiny. They reminded him that his ancestor Achilles had fought to defend Greek honor against the barbarians at Troy. Now it was his turn. And then they got to the practical details. Tarentum would provide money, lots of it. They would open their treasury to fund his campaign. They would supply ships to transport his army across the Adriatic Sea. They would provide troops to supplement his forces once he arrived. They would make him commander-in-chief of all Greek forces in Italy. More importantly, they offered him a strategic vision. Italy was just the beginning. Once the Romans were defeated, Pyrrhus could turn his attention to Sicily, where the Greek city of Syracuse was threatened by Carthage. After Sicily, why not Africa? Why not Spain? Why not everywhere? They were offering Pyrrhus the chance to build a Western empire to match Alexander's eastern conquests. It was everything Pyrrhus had ever wanted. His advisors urged caution. Cineas, his most trusted counselor and a brilliant diplomat in his own right, famously questioned the wisdom of the expedition. According to the ancient historian Plutarch, the conversation went something like this. If we defeat the Romans, Cineas asked, what will we do next? Sicily lies open to us, Pyrrhus replied. A wealthy island, torn by civil war, easy to conquer, and after Sicily, Africa and Carthage would be within reach. How could we fail with such resources? And then we could retake Macedon and all of Greece. No one could stand against us, and when we have conquered all these lands, Cineas asked, what shall we do then? Pyrrhus laughed. Then, my friend, we shall rest and drink and enjoy ourselves. Cineas paused. What prevents us from doing that now? It was a devastating question, and Pyrrhus had no good answer. He wanted to conquer not because he needed anything, but because conquering was who he was. The goal was never the destination, it was the journey, the struggle, the glory. Rest and enjoyment meant nothing to a man who defined himself through war. Pyrrhus dismissed Cineas's concerns and began preparing for the greatest campaign of his life. In the spring of 280 BC, Pyrrhus set sail for Italy with an army unlike anything the peninsula had ever seen. He brought approximately 25,000 soldiers, 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 2,000 archers. But the numbers alone don't capture what made this force special. The core of Pyrrhus's army was the Macedonian phalanx, the formation that had conquered the known world under Alexander. The phalanx consisted of heavily armored infantry armed with the sarissa, a pike roughly 18 feet long. When the phalanx advanced, it presented a wall of spear points that no cavalry could charge and no infantry could penetrate. It was the most sophisticated military technology of its age. Pyrrhus's phalangists were veterans, seasoned by years of warfare in the brutal succession conflicts that followed Alexander's death. They knew their business, and they knew they were the best. But the infantry was only part of the equation. Pyrrhus also brought elite cavalry, Thessalian horsemen, considered the finest in the Greek world, along with slingers, archers, and light troops from various allied nations. His army was a balanced, professional force capable of fighting in any terrain against any opponent. And then there were the elephants. Pyrrhus brought 20 war elephants to Italy, massive Indian elephants equipped with wooden towers on their backs, each carrying archers and javelin throwers. The Greeks had first encountered elephants during Alexander's campaigns in India, and the successors had incorporated them into their armies as the ancient equivalent of tanks. The Romans had never seen an elephant. Think about that for a moment. The most disciplined army in the Western Mediterranean, the legions that had conquered central Italy, had absolutely no idea what they were about to face. They had never encountered an 18-foot pike, let alone an armored beast weighing 6 tons. They were about to fight an army from the future. The crossing of the Adriatic was brutal. A spring storm scattered Pyrrhus's fleet, sinking ships and drowning men. Pyrrhus himself was nearly killed when his vessel was driven ashore on the Italian coast. But he made it, and by early summer, he had gathered his forces at Tarentum. His allies were less impressive than promised. The Tarentine troops were poorly trained and undisciplined, more interested in their comfortable lives than in serious warfare. Pyrrhus immediately imposed martial law on the city, closing the theaters and bathhouses, banning public festivals, and forcing every able-bodied man into military training. The Tarentines had hired a general, and they were going to get one whether they liked it or not. Many Tarentines fled the city rather than submit to Pyrrhus's discipline. Those who remained grumbled bitterly about their savior, but Pyrrhus didn't care about popularity. He cared about building an army capable of facing Rome, and Rome was coming. The Roman Republic in 280 BC was not yet the Mediterranean superpower it would become. It didn't control Africa or Spain or Greece or even all of Italy, but it was already something remarkable. For nearly 2 centuries, Rome had been fighting and winning. The Latin Wars, the Samnite Wars, the wars against the Etruscans, and the Gauls one by one. Rome had defeated its neighbors and absorbed them into an expanding confederation. The Roman system was simple but effective. Defeated peoples could either join Rome as allies with certain rights and obligations, or be destroyed utterly. Most chose to join. This gave Rome something unique in the ancient world: depth. When Rome lost a battle, and it did lose battles, it didn't collapse. It could absorb casualties that would have finished any Greek state. It could lose an army and raise another, and another, and another. Its reservoir of manpower seemed inexhaustible. The Roman army itself was built on a different principle than the Macedonian phalanx, where the phalanx was a single formation, rigid and overwhelming, but vulnerable to disruption. The Roman legion was flexible and adaptable. It was organized into smaller units called maniples, each capable of independent maneuver. The legionaries carried large shields and short swords, designed for close quarters combat. They fought with a ferocity and discipline that reflected their society, practical, ruthless, and absolutely committed to victory. When the Roman Senate learned that Pyrrhus had landed in Italy, they raised an army and sent it south under the command of Publius Valerius Laevinus, an experienced general. Laevinus had orders to crush the invader before he could establish himself, before he could rally the Greek cities and the Italic tribes to his cause. The two armies met near the city of Heraclea, on the coast of the Gulf of Taranto. It was the summer of 280 BC, neither side knew it, but they were about to fight one of the most important battles in ancient history. The plain of Heraclea stretched between the Ceres River and the sea, a flat expanse of farmland that would soon be drenched in blood. Pyrrhus arrived first and took up position on the south bank of the Ceres, with the river between him and the approaching Romans. It was a strong defensive position. Any attacker would have to cross the water under fire, then fight uphill against a prepared enemy. Pyrrhus intended to wait to let the Romans wear themselves out against his defenses, but the Romans had other ideas. Laevinus force marched his legions through the night, arriving at the Ceres at dawn. Without waiting to rest his troops, without pausing to scout the enemy position, he immediately began crossing the river at multiple fords. The Roman cavalry splashed across first, followed by wave after wave of infantry. Pyrrhus was caught off guard. He had expected the Romans to be cautious, to probe his defenses, to feel him out before committing to battle. That was how civilized armies fought, with maneuver and positioning, with careful assessment of the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. The Romans didn't fight like civilized armies. They fought like men who had never learned to be afraid. Pyrrhus scrambled to respond. He sent his cavalry to contest the river crossings, buying time for his infantry to form up. Then he rode to the front to see these Romans for himself. What he saw impressed him. The legionaries crossed the river in perfect order, their formations intact, their discipline unbroken despite the chaos of the fords. When Pyrrhus's cavalry charged them, they didn't scatter or panic. They locked shields, presented a wall of steel, and fought back with controlled fury. These weren't the soft, undisciplined troops Pyrrhus had expected. These were warriors. Their order is not barbarous, Pyrrhus reportedly muttered to one of his officers, watching the Roman formations emerge from the river. But we shall see whether their fighting is. The battle began in earnest around midday. The clash between the Roman legions and the Macedonian phalanx was a collision of military systems to fundamentally different approaches to warfare, each perfected over centuries, now meeting for the first time. The Romans advanced in their characteristic formation, 3 lines of infantry, arranged by age and experience. The youngest soldiers, the Hastati, formed the front line. Behind them came the Principes, men in the prime of life. And in the rear, the Triarii grizzled veterans held in reserve for the critical moment. Each line could fight, fall back, and be replaced by the next, creating a flexible, renewable assault. The phalanx, by contrast, was a single overwhelming hammer blow. Pyrrhus's Macedonians advanced in tight formation, their 18-foot Saresis leveled, creating a hedgehog of steel points that no enemy could approach. Where the Romans relied on individual skill and small unit tactics, the phalanx relied on mass and momentum. It was an irresistible force. For hours, the two armies ground against each other. The Romans would charge, crash against the wall of pikes, and fall back. The phalanx would advance, pushing the Romans before it, only to have fresh Roman units cycle forward to replace the exhausted. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. The plain filled with the screams of wounded men and the crash of metal on metal. Pyrrhus fought in the thick of it, as he always did. He led cavalry charges against the Roman flanks. He rallied wavering units. He personally killed so many enemies that his armor became drenched in blood, though ancient sources assure us it was all Roman blood, not his own. But the battle hung in the balance. 7 times ancient sources claim exactly 7 the two armies surged back and forth across the plain. Neither would break, neither would yield. The sun began to sink toward the horizon, and still the killing continued. Then Pyrrhus played his trump card. The elephants had been held in reserve behind the phalanx, waiting for the right moment. Now Pyrrhus ordered them forward. Imagine being a Roman legionary in the front lines. You've been fighting for hours. You're exhausted, covered in blood and sweat, your shield arm aching from blocking countless blows. The enemy in front of you is tough, but you've faced tough enemies before. You're Roman. You don't quit, and then the ground begins to shake. You hear something, a rumbling, a trumpeting, sounds you've never heard in your life. The men around you start to murmur. The formation ripples with uncertainty. And then, through the dust and smoke of battle, you see them, monsters, creatures from nightmare. Beasts as tall as a house, with legs like tree trunks and tusks like curved swords, with armored towers on their backs raining down arrows and javelins. They're coming straight at you, and there's nothing in your training, nothing in your experience, nothing in your entire world that has prepared you for this moment. The Roman cavalry broke first. Horses, sensible creatures, refused to approach the elephants. They screamed, reared, threw their riders, and bolted. The carefully organized Roman formations shattered as panicked horses crashed through infantry lines. Then the legionaries broke. It wasn't cowardice, it was pure animal terror, the primal fear of prey confronted by an apex predator. Men who had stood firm through hours of brutal combat simply turned and ran. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a massacre. Pyrrhus's cavalry, no longer opposed, swept around the Roman flanks and fell upon the fleeing legionaries. The phalanx advanced over ground carpeted with Roman dead. The elephants pursued, crushing everything in their path. The Battle of Heraclea was over. Pyrrhus had won, but at what cost? When the killing stopped and the sun set over the bloody plain, Pyrrhus surveyed the battlefield with growing unease. The Romans had lost approximately 7,000 dead and 2,000 captured. It was a serious defeat, but not a catastrophic one. The Roman system, with its deep reserves of manpower, could absorb such losses. Laevinus had escaped with the core of his army intact. There would be other legions, other battles. Pyrrhus had lost 4,000 of his best men. 4,000 doesn't sound like much compared to Roman losses. But these weren't just soldiers, they were irreplaceable professionals, veterans of countless campaigns, men who had trained for years to fight in the phalanx. Pyrrhus had no way to replace them. There was no reserve of Macedonian warriors waiting back in Epirus. Every man who fell at Heraclea was gone forever. Even worse, Pyrrhus had lost several of his most experienced commanders. The generals who knew how to coordinate cavalry with infantry, who understood the complex maneuvers of combined arms warfare, who could be trusted to command wings of the army independently, they were dead. The elephants had won the battle, but elephants couldn't lead men or make tactical decisions. Elephants couldn't train new phalangists or inspire troops to die for a cause. Pyrrhus was winning, but he was also bleeding. When congratulations poured in from his allies and subordinates, Pyrrhus's response was characteristically blunt. According to Plutarch, when one of his officers celebrated the victory, Pyrrhus replied, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." This was the first hint of the realization that would define Pyrrhus's legacy. You can win every battle and still lose the war. But in the summer of 280 BC, that reckoning was still in the future. For now, Pyrrhus was triumphant. The Romans had been beaten. The path to Rome itself lay open, or so it seemed. Pyrrhus made a fateful decision after Heraclea. Instead of immediately marching on Rome, a move that might have ended the war in one stroke, he paused to consolidate his position. There were practical reasons for this. His army needed rest. He needed to secure his alliance with the southern Italian tribes, who had been watching the battle carefully to see which way the wind was blowing. He needed reinforcements from the Greek cities, but there was also calculation. Pyrrhus believed that the Romans, having suffered such a devastating defeat, would be ready to negotiate. He had shown them his strength. Now he would show them his mercy. A generous peace offer might accomplish what another bloody battle could not. He dispatched Cineas, his most skilled diplomat, to Rome with terms. The offer was remarkably lenient. Pyrrhus would make peace with Rome. He would return all prisoners without ransom. He would even form an alliance with the Republic. All Rome had to do was agree to leave the Greek cities of southern Italy alone and grant independence to the Italic tribes, the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians, who had allied with Pyrrhus. From Pyrrhus's perspective, this was a reasonable compromise. Rome would keep its existing territory. The Greeks would keep theirs. Everyone could go home. Cineas arrived in Rome and began his negotiations. He was a consummate diplomat, charming and persuasive, and he worked his magic on the Roman senators. He distributed gifts. He made speeches praising Roman valor. He painted a picture of a prosperous peace, of two great powers respecting each other's spheres of influence. It was working. The Senate was wavering. War weariness was real. The defeat at Heraclea had shaken Roman confidence. Many senators were inclined to accept Pyrrhus's terms, and then an old man stood up to speak. Appius Claudius Caecus was ancient by Roman standards, nearly 90 years old, blind, and so infirm that he had to be carried into the Senate chamber on a litter. He had been one of Rome's greatest statesmen, a censor who had built the famous Appian Way, a leader whose career stretched back half a century, and he was absolutely furious. "I had accepted the misfortune of my eyes with some patience," he thundered, "but now I wish I had been deaf as well, so that I would not have to hear of these shameful deliberations." The Senate fell silent. Appius Claudius proceeded to demolish every argument for peace. Accept Pyrrhus's terms after one defeat. What would that tell Rome's allies, who had fought and died alongside the legions? What would it tell Rome's enemies, who would learn that the Republic could be bullied into submission by anyone with an army and some elephants? Rome did not negotiate with invaders on Roman soil. Rome did not accept terms dictated by foreign kings. Rome fought until it won, or until there was no Rome left. "Let this Pyrrhus leave Italy first," Appius Claudius declared. "Then, if he wishes, he may negotiate with us from his own country. But as long as he remains on our soil, we will fight him, even if he has defeated us 1,000 times. The Senate, shamed and inspired, voted to reject Pyrrhus's terms. Cineas returned empty-handed. When Pyrrhus asked him what Rome was like, Cineas delivered a chilling assessment. "The Roman Senate is an assembly of kings," he said. "And Rome itself is like the Hydra of legend, cut off one head, and to more grow in its place." Pyrrhus had won the battle, but he was beginning to understand what he was really fighting. The war continued through the winter of 280 to 279 BC. Pyrrhus consolidated his position in southern Italy, recruiting allies among the Samnites, Lucanians, and Bruttians. He absorbed fresh troops from the Greek cities and trained them to fight alongside his Macedonians. He studied Roman tactics, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. The Romans, meanwhile, raised new legions. They replaced their losses. They analyzed their defeat and developed countermeasures against the elephants' devices with iron spikes that could wound the beasts, incendiary weapons to panic them, tactics to target the vulnerable mahouts who controlled them. In the spring of 279 BC, the two armies met again at Asculum, in Apulia. This time, the Romans chose the ground rough, broken terrain that would hinder the phalanx's formation and limit the effectiveness of Pyrrhus's cavalry. They had learned from Heraclea. They were adapting. The Battle of Asculum was fought over 2 days, an unusually long engagement that demonstrated the grinding, attritional nature of this war. On the first day, the Romans succeeded in neutralizing Pyrrhus's advantages. The broken ground prevented the phalanx from forming properly. The elephants couldn't maneuver effectively in the rough terrain. Roman skirmishers harassed Pyrrhus's formations with javelins and arrows, then melted away before the Greeks could close to melee range. By nightfall, the battle was a draw. Both armies withdrew to their camps, exhausted and bloody. That night, Pyrrhus made his decision. He couldn't fight another day on Roman terms. He needed to force a decisive engagement on ground that favored his army. Before dawn, he moved his forces to a nearby plain flat, open terrain where the phalanx could form and the elephants could charge. When the Romans advanced to renew the battle, they found Pyrrhus waiting for them in perfect position. They attacked anyway. The second day of Asculum was Heraclea all over again, but worse. The phalanx and the legions crashed together with terrible violence. The fighting was even more intense than before, as both sides knew that everything was at stake. Roman commanders personally led charges against the Greek lines. Pyrrhus, as always, fought in the thickest of the combat. At one point, a Roman soldier broke through the king's bodyguard and hurled a javelin directly at Pyrrhus. The weapon struck his armor and nearly penetrated. Pyrrhus's horse was killed beneath him. He fought on foot until his men could bring him another mount. The elephant charge came earlier this time, before the Romans could deploy their countermeasures. The beasts crashed into the Roman flanks, sowing chaos and terror. The cavalry swept around to complete the envelopment. By late afternoon, the Romans were in full retreat. Pyrrhus had won again. But the butcher's bill was even higher than Heraclea. Pyrrhus had lost another 3,500 men, including many of his remaining officers and several of his closest friends. One ancient source claims that Pyrrhus himself was seriously wounded, though he refused to leave the field. This was when Pyrrhus made the statement that would immortalize him: "If we win one more such victory against the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." Another victory like this, and he would have no army left. This is the origin of the term Pyrrhic Victory, a win that costs so much it's essentially a defeat. We use the phrase today in business, in politics, in personal relationships, whenever someone achieves their goal but destroys themselves in the process. Pyrrhus invented the concept. The strategic situation after Asculum was grim for everyone. Pyrrhus had won 2 major battles, but had failed to knock Rome out of the war. His army was dangerously depleted, and he had no way to replace his losses with troops of equal quality. The Greek cities of southern Italy were proving to be unreliable allies, more interested in their own squabbles than in supporting his campaign. The Italic tribes who had joined him were starting to have second thoughts. Rome, meanwhile, was still standing. Battered, blooded, but unbroken, new legions were being raised. New commanders were being trained. The Republic's allies remained loyal partly from genuine commitment, partly from fear of what would happen if Rome fell and then recovered. Pyrrhus began to reconsider his entire strategy. Italy was proving far more difficult than he had anticipated. Perhaps it was time to look elsewhere. As if on cue, a new opportunity arrived. Ambassadors from Syracuse, the greatest Greek city in Sicily, arrived at Pyrrhus's camp with an urgent plea. Carthage, the North African superpower that controlled the western Mediterranean, was besieging Syracuse. The city would fall within months unless someone intervened. The Syracusans offered Pyrrhus the crown of Sicily if he would save them. It was exactly the kind of offer Pyrrhus couldn't refuse. Sicily was rich, fertile, and strategically vital. If he could unite the island under his rule, he would have a base of operations for future conquests, including, perhaps, an invasion of Carthage itself. And besides, he was getting nowhere in Italy. The Romans refused to be beaten. Maybe a change of scenery was exactly what he needed. In 278 BC, Pyrrhus gathered his forces and sailed for Sicily. It was the beginning of the end. Pyrrhus arrived in Sicily like a conquering hero. The island had been waiting for a savior. For decades, the Greek cities of Sicily had been losing ground to Carthage, the maritime empire that dominated the western Mediterranean from its capital in North Africa. Carthaginian armies had pushed the Greeks back, siege by siege, city by city, until only Syracuse and a handful of smaller towns remained free. The Greeks of Sicily remembered their glory days, the great tyrants who had built Syracuse into one of the mightiest cities in the world, the victories over Carthage that had seemed to secure Greek dominance forever. Now they faced extinction, and into this desperate situation walked Pyrrhus of Epirus, fresh from his victories over Rome, with his veteran army and his terrifying elephants. The Sicilian Greeks welcomed him as a liberator. Within months, Pyrrhus had transformed the strategic situation. He smashed a Carthaginian army in open battle, demonstrating once again his tactical brilliance. He captured the fortress of Eryx, a supposedly impregnable Carthaginian stronghold perched on a mountaintop, by leading the assault personally and being the first man over the walls. He swept through western Sicily, liberating Greek cities and driving the Carthaginians back toward their last major base at Lilybaeum. By 277 BC, Carthage was on the verge of losing Sicily entirely. Their ambassadors came to Pyrrhus offering peace. They would give up almost everything, retreat to a single corner of the island, and pay a massive indemnity. It was a stunning reversal, achieved in less than 2 years. Pyrrhus refused. He wanted total victory. He wanted to drive Carthage from Sicily completely. More than that, he wanted to invade Africa itself, to carry the war to Carthage's gates, to do what no Greek general had ever successfully done. This was the pattern of Pyrrhus's life, never satisfied with what he had achieved, always reaching for the next conquest, the next glory, the next impossible goal. Cineas had asked him, years ago, why he couldn't simply enjoy what he already possessed. Pyrrhus had no answer then, and he had no answer now. Conquest was his nature. Stopping was death. But to invade Africa, he needed ships, lots of ships. And ships required money, supplies, and most importantly, cooperation from the Sicilian Greeks. This is where everything fell apart. Pyrrhus had always been a better general than a politician. On the battlefield, he was unmatched, brilliant, decisive, inspiring, but ruling was different from fighting. Ruling required patience, compromise, the ability to manage competing interests and fragile egos. It required giving people a stake in your success rather than simply commanding their obedience. Pyrrhus had none of these skills. He treated Sicily like a conquered province rather than a collection of allies. He demanded money, supplies, and troops from cities that had invited him to be their liberator, not their master. He executed prominent Sicilians on suspicion of disloyalty, sometimes on flimsy evidence. He installed his own men in positions of power, ignoring local customs and sensibilities. The Greek cities that had welcomed him as a hero began to see him as a tyrant. Resistance grew. First it was grumbling, then protests, then outright defiance. Cities that had thrown open their gates to Pyrrhus now closed them against his tax collectors. Former allies began secret negotiations with Carthage. Better the devil they knew than this Greek king who seemed no different from any other conqueror. Pyrrhus responded with force, which only made things worse. He besieged rebellious cities, killed their leaders, confiscated their wealth. The spiral of violence and resentment accelerated. Meanwhile, news arrived from Italy. The Romans had not been idle during Pyrrhus's Sicilian adventure. They had regrouped, rebuilt their armies, and launched a new offensive against his remaining Italian allies. The Samnites and Lucanians, left without their champion, were being systematically crushed. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia were under siege. Pyrrhus faced an impossible choice: stay in Sicily and try to salvage his crumbling position, or return to Italy and try to save his original allies. Neither option was good. Both fronts were collapsing simultaneously. In the end, Sicily made the choice for him. A coalition of Sicilian cities, fed up with Pyrrhus's heavy-handed rule, formally broke with him and invited the Carthaginians back. The dream of a unified Greek Sicily, ruled by Pyrrhus, was dead. The invasion of Africa would never happen? In 275 BC, Pyrrhus gathered what remained of his army and prepared to leave Sicily. As his ships pulled away from the harbor of Syracuse, he reportedly looked back at the island and said, "What a wrestling ground, we are leaving for Carthage and Rome." It was a prophetic statement. Within a generation, Rome and Carthage would fight the First Punic War over Sicily, a conflict that would begin Rome's transformation from an Italian power into a Mediterranean empire. Pyrrhus had seen the future, but he wouldn't live to see it unfold. He was returning to Italy for a final reckoning. The Italy that Pyrrhus found upon his return was not the Italy he had left. 3 years was a long time in a war of survival. The Samnites, once proud and defiant, had been battered into submission by relentless Roman offensives. The Lucanians and Bruttians had suffered similar fates. The Greek cities, left to defend themselves, had either surrendered to Rome or were barely holding on. Worst of all, many of Pyrrhus's Italian allies blamed him for their predicament. He had promised to liberate them from Roman dominance, and instead he had abandoned them to chase glory in Sicily. Now he was back, but where had he been when they needed him most? Pyrrhus tried to rally his coalition, but the enthusiasm of 280 BC was gone. He was no longer a liberator, he was a general who had failed to deliver on his promises. His army, though still formidable, was a shadow of the force that had crossed the Adriatic 5 years earlier. The veteran Macedonians who had formed the core of his phalanx were mostly dead, replaced by Italian levies and Sicilian recruits who lacked their training and experience. Even the elephants were depleted. Of the 20 war elephants Pyrrhus had brought to Italy, only a handful remained. The Romans, by contrast, had never been stronger. They had learned from their defeats at Heraclea and Asculum. They had developed tactics specifically designed to counter Pyrrhus's army. They had raised new legions, trained new officers, and most importantly, they had never stopped believing they would win. Rome didn't give up. That was the secret. That was what made them different from every other opponent Pyrrhus had ever faced. You could beat them, you could slaughter their armies, you could humiliate their generals, and they would just come back for more, again and again and again. In the spring of 275 BC, the two armies met for the final time near the town of Beneventum in southern Italy. The Battle of Beneventum was everything the Romans had been waiting for. They chose the ground carefully broken, wooded terrain that would disrupt the phalanx and limit the effectiveness of the elephants. They had studied Pyrrhus's tactics for 5 years, and they knew exactly what to expect. This time, there would be no surprises. The Roman commander was Manius Curius Dentatus, a tough, experienced general who embodied Roman virtues. He was famous for his incorruptibility when Samnite ambassadors once tried to bribe him with gold. He had been found cooking turnips over a small fire and had rejected their offer with contempt. A man who was satisfied with turnips, he said, had no need of gold. Curius Dentatus had no intention of repeating the mistakes of Lavinus at Heraclea. He fortified his camp and waited, forcing Pyrrhus to attack on Roman terms. Pyrrhus had no choice. His army was deteriorating by the day. His Italian allies were wavering. If he didn't force a decisive victory soon, his coalition would collapse entirely. He had to attack. The battle began at dawn. Pyrrhus attempted a surprise assault on the Roman camp, sending a portion of his army on a night march to strike from an unexpected direction. It was a clever plan, the kind of audacious maneuver that had won him victories throughout his career. But the night march went wrong. The column got lost in the darkness, delayed by the difficult terrain. By the time they arrived, the sun was up and the Romans were fully alert. The element of surprise was gone. Curius Dentatus counterattacked. The fighting was intense, but this time the Romans had the advantage. The broken ground prevented the phalanx from forming its devastating hedgehog of pikes. Roman skirmishers targeted the elephants with fire arrows and incendiary pots, panicking the beasts. One group of elephants, maddened by the flames, turned and stampeded back through Pyrrhus's own lines, trampling his infantry. The very weapons that had won Heraclea now became instruments of Pyrrhus's defeat. By midday, it was over. Pyrrhus's army broke and fled. Thousands were killed or captured, including several elephants that would later be paraded through Rome in triumph. Pyrrhus himself escaped, but his Italian campaign was finished. He had lost his first major battle in Italy, and unlike the Romans, he had no reserves left to raise a new army. The aftermath of Beneventum was swift and brutal. Pyrrhus's Italian allies, seeing that the tide had turned decisively, abandoned him in droves. The Samnites surrendered to Rome. The Lucanians and Bruttians followed. One by one, the cities that had welcomed Pyrrhus as a liberator opened their gates to Roman legions. Tarentum, the city that had started it all by inviting Pyrrhus to Italy, held out a while longer, but it was clear that its fate was sealed. Without Pyrrhus's army to defend it, the city was doomed. Pyrrhus gathered the remnants of his forces, perhaps 8,000 men, less than a third of what he had brought to Italy 5 years earlier, and sailed back to Epirus. He left a garrison in Tarentum, a token force that could delay but not prevent the inevitable Roman conquest. He had come to Italy dreaming of empire. He left having accomplished nothing. Well, almost nothing. Pyrrhus's invasion had delayed Rome's conquest of southern Italy by about a decade. It had demonstrated that Rome could be beaten on the battlefield, that the legions were not invincible. It had given the Greek cities a few more years of freedom before they were absorbed into the Roman system. But in the end, Rome got everything it wanted. By 270 BC, Tarentum had fallen. By 270 BC, the last resistance in southern Italy had been crushed. The peninsula was unified under Roman rule for the first time in history. Pyrrhus had won every major battle in Italy except the last one, and he had lost the war. You might expect that Pyrrhus, having finally faced the limits of his military genius, would have learned something from the experience. Perhaps he would return to Epirus, consolidate his kingdom, and live out his days in peace. If you expected that, you haven't been paying attention to who Pyrrhus was. He was incapable of stopping. War was his nature. The moment he returned to Epirus, he began planning new campaigns. He invaded Macedon and briefly seized the throne, only to lose it again. He attacked the Greek city-states, seeking to build a power base in mainland Greece. He was constantly in motion, constantly fighting, constantly reaching for the next crown. Into 70 BC, the same year Tarentum fell to Rome, Pyrrhus launched an invasion of the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula of Greece. His target was Sparta, the legendary warrior city that had once dominated the Greek world. But Sparta was no longer what it had been. The city that had held the pass at Thermopylae, that had crushed Athens in the Peloponnesian War, was now a shadow of its former self. Its population had collapsed, its military system had decayed, its glory days were centuries in the past, and yet the Spartans fought. When Pyrrhus arrived at Sparta's walls, he expected an easy victory. Instead, he found the entire population, men, women, and children digging trenches and building fortifications. Spartan women, famous for their fierce patriotism, worked alongside the men and reportedly told them they would rather die than see their city fall. Pyrrhus attacked and was repulsed. He attacked again and was repulsed again. The Spartans, vastly outnumbered, held their city with a ferocity that surprised even a veteran like Pyrrhus. The siege dragged on. Pyrrhus's army began to suffer. Supplies ran short. Disease broke out. And then word came that Antigonus Gonatas, king of Macedon, was marching to Sparta's relief. Pyrrhus was forced to withdraw. Another campaign, another failure, but he wasn't finished yet. There was one more city to conquer, one more prize to claim. Argos, the city of Argos, in the northeastern Peloponnese, was caught in the middle of a succession dispute. Two factions were vying for control, and one of them invited Pyrrhus to intervene on their behalf. In exchange, they would make him master of the city. It was a small prize compared to Sicily or Italy or even Sparta, but Pyrrhus couldn't resist. He marched his army to Argos and prepared to take the city by night assault. What followed was one of the most bizarre and ignominious deaths in military history. Pyrrhus's army entered Argos through a gate opened by sympathizers inside the city. The plan was to move quickly through the streets, seize key positions, and present the population with a fait accompli by morning. But the streets of Argos were narrow and winding. The army's largest elephants couldn't fit through the gates and had to be unloaded and brought through one by one, creating delays and confusion. The element of surprise was lost. The opposing faction raised the alarm. Fighting erupted throughout the city. The battle turned into a chaotic street fight, exactly the kind of engagement where Pyrrhus's tactical genius counted for nothing. In the narrow streets, there was no room for maneuver, no opportunity for the brilliant flanking attacks that had won him so many victories. It was just brutal, close quarters killing in the dark. Pyrrhus fought in the thick of it, as he always did. At some point during the night, he found himself in a melee near one of the city's temples. He was attacking a young Argive soldier when the soldier's mother, watching from a rooftop above, picked up a roof tile and hurled it down at the king. The tile struck Pyrrhus on the neck, just below his helmet. He collapsed from his horse, stunned and paralyzed. Before his men could reach him, an Argive soldier named Pyrrhus ran up and cut off his head. Thus died Pyrrhus of Epirus, king of Epirus, king of Macedon, king of Sicily, killed by a roof tile thrown by an old woman in a pointless street fight over a city that meant nothing. He was 46 years old. The news of Pyrrhus's death spread quickly through the Greek world. Antigonus Gonatas, who had been marching to oppose Pyrrhus, reportedly wept when he heard the news. Despite being enemies, he had respected Pyrrhus as the greatest general of the age. He gave Pyrrhus's body an honorable cremation and sent the ashes back to Epirus for burial. The soldiers who had followed Pyrrhus through Italy, Sicily, and Greece dispersed. His kingdom of Epirus fell into the hands of his successors, who lacked his genius and would never restore its brief moment of greatness. The dream of a Western Greek empire, of a successor to Alexander who would rule from Italy to Africa, died with him. Within a generation, Pyrrhus was largely forgotten by everyone except military historians. His campaigns had achieved nothing lasting. His conquests had crumbled. His legacy was ... what exactly? A phrase? Pyrrhic Victory. That's what we remember, not his tactical brilliance, not his personal courage, not his status as one of the greatest generals who ever lived. We remember him as a cautionary tale, the man who won every battle but lost the war, the man whose victories cost more than they were worth. Is that fair? Perhaps not entirely. Pyrrhus was genuinely brilliant, a commander whose abilities were recognized by Hannibal and Alexander alike. He fought the Romans when Rome was on the rise, when their system of alliances and reserves was just becoming the unstoppable machine that would conquer the Mediterranean. He came closer to stopping them than anyone would for generations, but he also embodied a fundamental flaw: restlessness, an inability to consolidate, a compulsion to keep reaching for more even when what he had was slipping through his fingers. He couldn't stop. He couldn't be satisfied. He couldn't build anything that would last. And in the end, that's what separates the great conquerors from the truly great leaders. Alexander conquered an empire, but he also built cities, spread culture, and created something that outlasted him. Pyrrhus conquered nothing. He left nothing behind but corpses and a phrase.